Hello everyone, welcome back to the Mr. Fliphagen YouTube channel. I'm Mr. Fliphagen, but you can call me Mel, and today we're taking a look at a map that many of you may not have looked at, or that you may not even have played that many games on. Polar. This is one of the few strictly low tier maps in game, being restricted from tier 1 to tier 3. But surprisingly enough, it still carries a lot of Easter eggs, especially historical ones. And even more surprisingly, a lot of the Easter eggs are unique to this map, and I believe that we haven't covered any one of these in episodes prior to this one. I also want to give a big thanks to my assistant Milsnerf, who identified most of the Easter eggs in this video. So stick around and get ready for a bit of a history lesson. Let our voyage begin. We start off at the southern spawn at G7, where we see a frozen runway on one of the islands. Parked on the wayside lay a pair of these big orangish colored aircraft. These are variants of the Tupolev TB3, and to be specific, the exact model is the SSSR N-169 Aviarctica. The aircraft and its mission IRL was a continuation of Soviet explorations and expeditions in the Russian Arctic. Specifically, the Soviets wanted to set up a station to monitor weather phenomena like temperature, air pressure, etc. This station would, however, be established on a massive piece of drift ice, so as time went on, the ice and the station that it would sit on would drift away further from the pole. 35 men would be selected for this mission, and aircraft would be used to transport all the equipment and crew. 5 aircraft would be used in this expedition, a scout aircraft and 4 four-engined aircraft, one of which being the N-169. After transporting the goods, the aircraft would return back to Russia. The expedition would start in March 1937, and the station that would be set up would be named North Pole 1. Only 4 men would stay at the station monitoring: leader Ivan Papanin, oceanographer Peter Shishov, meteorologist Yevgeny Fedorov, and radio operator Ernst Krenkel. After 274 days, the station had drifted around 2,600 kilometers towards the Greenland Sea, and in February 1938, an icebreaker would assist in evacuating the camp successfully. On this same camp, every now and then a smaller biplane lands and takes off. This is a Polikarpov ARK-5, a modified variant of the Polikarpov ARK-5 that was refitted to include a heating system and equipment to conduct repairs in Arctic conditions. Only 2 of them would receive this modification though. Now we travel to the eastern map border, where on the outside we see this little freighter, and if it looks familiar, well, that's because it technically is. If you look extremely closely, you'll realize that this is just a reskin of the SS Mojave model that we saw in the New Dawn video. But this time around she has a beautiful black and white paint scheme. Why I bring up the fact that it is a reskin is because it makes it practically impossible to identify, because you will not be able to match the model exactly to any real-life counterpart. On top of that, there are no nameplates on the ship, and even on top of that, many Soviet ships that were built look roughly like this ship. I personally believe it to be an Anadyr-class steam merchant, possibly the Stalingrad, but it could even be a steamer like the Tovarish Stalin or the icebreaker Alexander Sibiryakov, or any other associated sister ships. But I'm pretty sure it's still an Anadyr-class though. But I am nowhere near as certain on what ship exactly this would be. They all have the same paint scheme, the same rough layout, but all of them have minor differences because the model in-game is just a reskin. With that note out of the way, I will tell you a little bit more about the Stalingrad's history. The Stalingrad was a steam merchant built in 1932 in Leningrad. As I said before, she was a part of the Anadyr-class of steam merchants, 10 of which were built. And while they were mainly focused on transporting cargo, they were designed so that they could also have some capacity to transport passengers as well. They were built to mainly serve in waters near or in the Arctic and in the Russian northeast. In 1934, the Stalingrad, along with her sister ship Smolensk, played an indirect part in the rescue operation of the SS Chelyuskin, being sent out to Kamchatka and bringing back the survivors and the rescue team to Vladivostok. While most of the Anadyr-class would survive and serve up until the 1960s, the Stalingrad wasn't as fortunate. She would sink in 1942 as a part of the Arctic convoy PQ-18. This convoy would be attacked near Spitsbergen by a German submarine, and while this submarine only hit one torpedo on the Stalingrad, it would still hit midships, causing a boiler explosion. In the end, the Stalingrad would sink in as little as 3 minutes and 48 seconds, where out of the 87 people on board the ship, 21 would pass away. Next up, we travel closer to the center, and while the possible last ship played an indirect part in an Arctic rescue operation, this ship over here is, well, playing a direct one. This is the Icebreaker Krassin, commissioned by the Russians and built by the British. She would be completed in 1917 under the name Svyatogor. She was actually supposed to make her voyage to Russia during March 1917, but unfortunately suffered a collision with a convoy ship, so the trip had to be delayed, but the Krassin would make it to Arkhangelsk in Russia by June. Not many months later, though, in November, during the Russian Civil War, the Krassin would be captured by the British intervention movement in Arkhangelsk, and would be transferred and serve in Scapa Flow under British rule. The Bolsheviks would win the Civil War, and in an attempt to neutralize the relations between the British and the Soviets, a trade agreement would be signed in 1921 for the return of the ships seized by Britain during the intervention period, including Svyatogor. On the Soviet side, the deal was being handled by the Commissar of Foreign Trade, Leonid Krassin. Can you see where this is going? And after being transferred back to the Soviet Union, she would actually finally get to serve as an icebreaker under the Soviets, operating near Tallinn and in the Baltic Sea. In 1926, Leonid Krassin would pass away, and the icebreaker would be renamed Krassin in his honor. And now this is where we will start to talk about the entire scene we see the Krassin in-game. In the spring of 1928, the Italian explorer, and I apologize for the pronunciation, Umberto Nobile had planned to set up a polar expedition with the airship Italia. He had conducted a similar successful mission a few years before, but unfortunately things didn't go so well this time around. During Italia's return from the expedition, it drove into a storm, and after a while of flying, the airship lost altitude and crashed into ice, ripping the gondola from the envelope, and as a result, the envelope would get lighter and gain altitude, continuing to drift, still with 6 people on board. The survivors in the gondola, however, managed to set up a camp. 6 countries would play a part in this rescue of the Italia survivors: the USSR, Italy, France, Sweden, Finland, and Norway. The Krassin would play a major part in this operation, being the first and only ship that would be able to break through the ice and reach the survivors. While the Krassin would manage to save the survivors from the gondola, the crew who had drifted away with the envelope would unfortunately never be found. On its way back, the Krassin would have to play a part in yet another rescue operation, this time of a German ocean liner who had had its hull breached. The ship luckily didn't sink, as the crews of the ships managed to patch up and repair the damage. Krassin and her crew's action in many a rescue operation would earn her multiple awards, alongside widespread fame across the entire world. During the Second World War, the Krassin would participate in many convoys, and at one point the Soviets and the Americans were even negotiating a lease or purchase of some icebreakers like the Krassin. So the Krassin sailed to America, but was found to be in dire need of repairs. And while the two powers managed to negotiate the repairs of the vessel, she would never actually serve under the US. Alongside repairs, she would also be fitted with self-defense weaponry. Krassin would participate in the Ajax 178 transatlantic convoy, and later would even join the PQ-15 convoy in 1942, that consisted of as many as 25 merchant ships. Later that year, the Krassin, along with the convoy, would be chased down by the Admiral Scheer after getting spotted by German aircraft. The Scheer would lose sight of them though, and the convoy would get away, as the weather conditions were rather poor. Through the years of 1953 to 1960, the Krassin would be heavily modernized and continue to serve in the north. In 1972, the Krassin would receive a second modernization and be used in various research expeditions. In the 1990s, she was finally going to face retirement, originally planning to be sold for scrap. After many efforts of the crew and the public, enough interest in conserving the vessel was eventually mustered. and through the 90s into the early 2000s, the Krassin would be repaired and find use as a museum ship that still exists to this day. And holy crap, that was a lot for a single ship, but it's honestly so cool seeing that this ship has survived through so many trials and tribulations, and that is still conserved to this day, with a shit ton of history under its belt. Oh, and while we're at it, please take some time to look up, for what we see flying above our heads is yet another Easter egg. This is a Tupolev ANT-25, and specifically, it is the ANT-25 used by the famous Valery Chkalov. The ANT-25 was built in, you guessed it, the Soviet Union, as an experimental aircraft excelling in extreme long-range flight. Only 2 were built though, and while it was also tested as a bomber, it would never see practical use as one, mostly because it was so large and so slow that it would become a very easy target to shoot down or intercept. Chkalov's flight would take place from the 18th to the 20th of June 1937. In the aircraft, along with Chkalov, flew co-pilot Georgy Baidukov and navigator Alexander Belyakov. The flight was planned to start from Moscow, and the aircraft would fly across the North Pole, over Canada, and to San Francisco in America. And a detail I'm actually super excited about in regards to this Easter egg is that during the 19th of June, the engine noises from Chkalov's plane were actually heard from the North Pole 1 drifting station. You know, the Easter egg we were talking about earlier. Anyway, after crossing the North Pole, the crew would start running into problems. They flew through and against storm winds, and parts of the aircraft, like the propeller, were starting to ice, all draining the aircraft's fuel. And while flying over Oregon in the US, they were dangerously low on it, and eventually found an airfield they could land on, because they had no other choice at that point. While they had not reached San Francisco, they had made it to Person Airfield in Portland, Oregon, and they had flown 9,130 kilometers in a record-breaking trip that would last 63 hours and 16 minutes. Moving towards the west, you can spot this little encampment, and floating in the water lays a flying boat. This is a Dornier DO J Wal, and they were introduced back in 1923. While many of them weren't built, only around 250 were actually built, they still were relatively popular and exported to a lot of different countries like Japan, Russia, Italy, etc. These were also heavily modified, some being used for military purposes, while others would be used for things such as airmail or to even carry passengers. They saw service until around 1940. 20 DOJs would be exported to the USSR during 1927 and 1928, and more would be commissioned later. And as you can probably guess, these also did see service in Soviet Arctic expeditions. The DOJ was also used in an Arctic expedition by a Norwegian explorer named Roald Amundsen, who attempted to fly and reach the North Pole in 1925. 2 DOJs would be used, but unfortunately Amundsen's aircraft would be damaged. Despite it, that had been the furthest north anyone had flown by aircraft by that point. While unrelated, I wanted to mention that Roald Amundsen would actually disappear in an air expedition searching for the Italia. Yes, that Italia from one of the previous Easter eggs. Now we move to the western map border, where we can see this pretty sailing ship sailing down the south. This is the Carnegie, an American brigantine yacht originally constructed in 1909 that would be used essentially as a floating laboratory to measure Earth's magnetic fields. Way back in the day, sailors were very reliant on their compasses in navigation. An accurate compass reading would allow for smooth and accurate course setting, but unfortunately this was not the case. When looking at maps at the northernmost and southernmost poles, we talk about true north and true south, but compasses didn't actually point to true north, they pointed to magnetic north. Turns out they are not the same, and this would become actually a very big issue in navigation, because there would be a discrepancy in the true north in the maps and the magnetic north shown by the compass. So the mission of the Carnegie and her crew was to map out the magnetic fields compasses rely on, to both make navigation more accurate and safe, but to also achieve an understanding of how Earth's magnetic fields work and move around. The measuring equipment was housed in glass domes on the ship, which would allow the crew to make measurements despite the conditions at sea. The Carnegie was also built and modified to contain as little ferrous metal as possible, so as to not introduce any variables that could affect their readings. Data would be collected throughout 7 voyages, in which the Carnegie would sail basically everywhere, even to the North and South Poles. During the 7th voyage, James P. Ault, who was both the captain and a scientist, would hold lectures in various cities the Carnegie would dock at, and the ship would even be open to the public. Even cross-scientific teamwork would be done, as the captain and the crew would even collect samples and data of marine life like plankton that would be sent to museums and other scientific institutes working with oceanography. Unfortunately, the 7th voyage would be cut short, as while refueling in Samoa, an explosion would happen below deck on the Carnegie, which would start a fire on board, burning it all down. As a result of this explosion, Captain Ault, along with the cabin boy, would be fatally injured, and thus tragically, this beauty of a ship, contributing massively to scientific progress, would be lost forever. The final Easter egg was also a bit difficult to identify. It's located on the F2 square, and as you can see, it is a ship crashed next to this iceberg, sinking, and there's a camp located right next to it. There is no name on the stern, and it's rather difficult to ID the ship just based on what we see above water, so I tried going below water to get a better picture of the ship. After some searching, I was convinced that this ship model seemed to be based on either the Alexander Sibiryakov, Vladimir Rusanov, or the Gregory Sedov. Especially this drawing of the Sedov looks very similar to the model in game. But, well, we have a few problems. The Gregory Sedov and the Vladimir Rusanov were both scrapped, not sunk, and the Sibiryakov was sunk in open water by shelling from the Admiral Scheer, not reminiscent of the scene in game. Milsnerf, who helped to research this video, suggested that it may be the steamship Chelyuskin, and looking at some depictions of it sinking, well, let's just say that they're the most similar to the scene in game. So while the Chelyuskin does not look like the model in game, we believe the scene to depict the Chelyuskin's downfall. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What was the Chelyuskin? Let's get some background information first. The Chelyuskin was built in 1933 in Copenhagen, Denmark. Originally named Lena, it was bought by the Soviet Union and renamed Chelyuskin to partake in an experiment to navigate through the Northern Sea route by itself. The Soviets had already planned on making the Northern Sea route a quote-unquote normally operating sea route. The Northern Sea route had only been sailed through using Icebreaker though, and still the Icebreaker that had been used had been severely crippled just due to the sheer amount of ice it had encountered. Chelyuskin was a freighter though, not an icebreaker. And apparently even a government committee wasn't convinced that this was a good idea, and even described the ship as unfit for polar conditions, and therefore unfit for this mission. But the captain seems to have been persuaded to still attempt on making the expedition. On the 16th July 1933, the Chelyuskin would start her voyage from Leningrad, and would stop at Copenhagen and Murmansk before continuing through the Northern Sea route to Wrangel Island, located a bit north from the Bering Strait, and then continuing to the Bering Strait. The Chelyuskin was captained by Vladimir Voronin, and the expedition was led by Otto Schmidt. And funnily enough, do you remember Ernst Krenkel from the first Easter egg in this video? Yeah, he was on this boat too. This video is starting to feel like an epic cinematic universe, but I digress. On the 13th of August, less than a month from their departure, the ship began to encounter ice, and very quickly started taking hull damage from it scraping up against its sides. Who would expect that to happen to a freighter unfit for polar conditions? But luckily the damage was repaired using cement and wooden beams. The Krassin would be called in for assistance through the ice, making their way through the Kara Sea. Unfortunately, despite Krassin leading the way, The Chelyuskin was still taking damage because her beam was wider than the Krassin's beam, so the wake the Krassin made was still simply too narrow for the freighter. Later, the Alexander Sedov would take the Krassin's place in escorting Chelyuskin, and while at the point they got to sail through some open waters, they'd encounter even more ice along the journey. After reaching the Sannikov Strait, the ice conditions would lighten, but by the 20th of September, the ice troubles would continue, and she'd get stuck in ice near the Kolyushkin Gulf, drifting along with it southeast. The captain and expedition leader would contact the captain of the icebreaker Fedor Litke for assistance, but the Litke had sustained severe damage from a prior endeavor, like losing a propeller and having sustained damage to her pumps, steering gear and rudder. Despite that, the captain of the Litke would attempt to sail in for assistance, but after a few attempts had to call off the operation and return to port. What was worse was that the ice the Chelyuskin was stuck in had started drifting back north, away from the Bering Strait. In February, ice from both sides would start crushing the ship, crippling it. Supplies were packed and moved onto the ice, and after being under pressure for a bit less than 3 hours, the Chelyuskin would sink, with only one casualty. The crew and passengers of the ship would salvage as much material and provisions they could from the now sunken ship. They'd build sleeping huts and even a watchtower to monitor the ice. Help was called and a rescue party would be set up that would rescue the survivors by aircraft. 18 aircraft would be assigned with 21 pilots, 27 flight engineers and 3 observers. The rescue would be made difficult though, as the weather was consistently poor, and they did not know the exact location of the wreck site. The pilot Anatoly Lyapidevsky would be the first to locate the survivors on the 5th of March, and would land and rescue the first 12 survivors, being 10 women and 2 young girls. Weather would worsen, making attempts to reach the camp nearly impossible, and only during the 7th to the 13th of April could the evacuation continue and successfully be completed. And those were all the Easter eggs in this map, and it is really cool to see historical events being portrayed in this map in form of various dioramas, and it's honestly insane that Wargaming or Lesta put this much attention into a map that is only ever seen at low tier. It really feels like this map and the details were created like as a tribute to the polar and Arctic expeditions that the Soviet Union made. It really shows the passion that the developers had for this game back during the good old days, and I just think that that's really, really cool. Anyway, what did you think of these Easter eggs? Were there any I got wrong, or any you wanna add? And what map should I take a look at next? Feel free to leave all your thoughts in the comments down below. I've been Mr. Flipwagen. May Saint Anhalt bless you, and I'll see you in the next video.